Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. Barry Jones, SP History, continuing our series on the deep state. We've worked our way through the formation of the deep state. And of course, we define the deep state as the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. One of the entities makes up the national security apparatus is the CIA. And we are currently engaged in a discussion about all the covert ops that happened on the CIA's watch, especially in the 50s leading into the 60s. And of course, ultimately, our objective is to tie uh, this deep state, and of course, that includes the CIA, into the assassination of JFK and others in the 60s, and of course, even the Watergate scandal in the 70s. So we are looking at the covert ops, and last week we we started with a discussion of, I'm just going year by year in chronological order, all these different covert ops. You remember how the CIA was formed in 47, that passage of the National Security Act. Included in that was the classified version of the bill, which granted authority to the CIA to create a super secret subcommittee called the 5412 Committee, and it would be governed or run, chaired by whoever was vice president at the time. And its job was to conduct covert ops all around the world. And its cover was to, or pretext was to stop the spread of communism. So all of these covert ops that we're discussing are launched with Richard Nixon as the vice president. And of course, Allen Dulles is the director of the CIA. And his brother, John Foster Dulles, is the director of the State Department. And all of these deep state figures are working together. And of course, they're using or arguing to the public that these covert ops are necessary to stop the spread of communism. But as we've learned already, a lot of this has nothing to do with communism. That's just a pretext. And that includes the operation in 1954 in Guatemala called Operation PB Success. This is a successful coup whereby the American government, the CIA in particular, overthrew or violently evicted the democratically elected Arbenz and installed in his place a U.S. puppet named Armas as the new president of Guatemala. Here you see the paperwork there, document. This is obviously in an effort to remove a problem to somebody who was deemed a threat to U.S. interests, which was Jacobo Arbenz. You can see here, he was smeared as a communist. You see the article there, the Red Outpost in Central America. That is to indicate that the leader of Guatemala is in bed or in league with the communists. And we, in our containment doctrine, which was put forth by first the State Department and John Foster Dulles, and then backed by Eisenhower, that became our official foreign policy. It became in our interest to overthrow Arbenz. And the bottom picture here says why Democrats and Republicans in Congress worked together to press President Eisenhower to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz. It was all because he'd been smeared as a communist. Really, what it was about was United Fruit Company. Remember back, we've talked about United Fruit before. They were very much interested in Hawaii for the sugarcane, Cuba for the sugarcane, and Guatemala is another one of these countries that they're interested in for resource purposes, specifically land for their plantations, railroads for the transport of their crops, ports for their access to world markets, and their telephone system ownership for communication purposes. United Fruit owned at the time 70% of the land, 100% of the railroads, 100% of the ports, and 100% of the telephones. And Arbenz, like the earlier situation in Iran, was trying to preserve Guatemala's natural resources for the Guatemalan people. And as such, became a threat to United Fruit. So United Fruit went to Eisenhower, or actually, as part of the deep state, they just sent word up the chain, up the line. And guys like John Foster and Allen Dulles went to Eisenhower and said, hey, we need to take out this communist. And once you smear him as a communist, it basically gives the CIA carte blanche to do whatever they want. And of course, they got into the operation and realized they needed the help of the military. That's when they went to Eisenhower. He sent the military in as the hammer. And when it was all said and done, the United Fruit had gotten what it wanted. So this is again a merging of the public and private sectors, ultra vires, maximizing profits, the expense of public interest, and immunize yourself afterwards. This is what the United States government is in the business of doing now. It is helping businesses, big business, these big corporations, in their effort to maximize their profits. The government has become their partner. In 1954, a report was authored called the Doolittle Report, and it had some interesting conclusions. Now, I note these because these are not covert operations, but I bring this up in this lineage of events because it shows that some people were beginning to be aware of this rogue elephant we now call CIA, and they're trying to warn the powers that be if someone doesn't get a handle on this CIA, it's going to begin operating domestically, doing the same things it's doing overseas. It's going to start doing them here at home. Anyway, according to this report, the Doolittle report, it said that the CIA was, quote, badly managed and unaccountable. That's one of the definitions of these deep staters, unaccountable and unelected. Dulles, according to the report, was overly zealous. The Doolittle report says, quote, there are no rules in such a game. If the United States is to survive, long-standing concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. And what basically the thesis is that the United States is going to be a beacon around the world of a fair play or of democracy, human rights, I mean, whatever term you want to put to it, then it has to start operating that way itself and abiding by these principles, whether they are advantageous or not. That brings us to the Phoenix Project, which we've already indicated. We've talked about it, touched on it earlier, its version in Vietnam, but it had other versions in other countries and other versions as far as what its purpose was. Where we talked about it before, it was part of the MK Ultra program, which was utilized by the CIA to break the brains or exercise or research mind control through torture and drugs and hypnosis, et cetera, in Vietnam. But it had another aspect to it. It involved two other countries, Laos and Cuba. And it was a money-making scheme. The Phoenix Project was engaged in heroin trafficking. The heroin would be smuggled out of the Golden Triangle, which is Southeast Asia, so it could be Vietnam or Laos, through Cuba and its proxy government there under the leadership of Batista, and into the inner cities of the United States. Is what we call the French Connection. There's a movie out. I think Gene Hackman played the lead part in the movie called The French Connection. And of course, it was a stupendous success. The CIA had several objectives in this part, and that was to raise a bunch of money off the books to finance all their covert ops. And drug smuggling has long been one of the most lucrative off the books money making schemes ever invented. So it succeeded as far as that was concerned. It also, one of the purposes was to poison certain communities within the United States, which is why they targeted the inner cities. So you can use your own imagination as to why the inner cities, what demographic make up the inner cities during this period of time, and why the drugs were intentionally sold there. Anyway, this was considered by everybody involved to be very, very successful. The other part of the Phoenix Project was an assassination operation. And during this period of time, the CIA tortured and killed over 20,000 Vietnamese citizens. That should actually be 40,000. It's a misprint. It was actually 40,000. So, and of course, the numbers are, it's an estimate. We don't have uh, precise numbers on that, but it was also considered a success. It wasn't necessarily just assassination for the purposes of assassination. A lot of it was research, and the people were so wasted after the research on them that they were, you know, they died. The research was fatal to them. 40,000, mostly Vietnamese non-combatants. Hardly any of them were POWs. So this Phoenix project is extremely controversial, obviously, and and for just a whole host of reasons, drug smuggling, targeting certain populations in the United States, assassinating or killing humans involved in research. It's just a terrible, terrible legacy of the United States. It's one of the reasons why I mentioned this earlier. The South Vietnamese turned against the Americans and their so-called help in the Vietnam War, because it's hard to tell who the enemy was. In 1956, another report is authored called the Bruce Lovett Report. And in this, 2 years later, from the original Doolittle report, the CIA was called a, quote, overseas kingmaker. And of course, we've already seen it. We've seen it in Italy, we've seen it in Iran, and now we've seen it in Guatemala. And according to this report, the CIA had, quote, promiscuous freedom to go barging around into other countries. And it was not a generous report at all. So just like we have warnings from Truman in '63, looking back, and warnings from different media members and the Senator Fulbright from Arkansas about the CIA being a rogue elephant, all in the '60s after the JFK assassination. People said, well, where were the warnings before that? Well, here are a couple: the Doolittle Report and the Bruce Lovett Report. That same year, in 1956, regarding another Latin American country, if you remember, historically, when we really got involved in Latin America was when Teddy Roosevelt issued the Roosevelt Corollary, which is an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said, if you stay out of our country, we'll stay out of yours, talk to Europe. And then the Roosevelt Corollary added Latin America and South America to it. Basically said, if you stay out of our hemisphere, we'll stay out of yours. And we became the sort of the overseer by our definition of the entire Western Hemisphere. We didn't ask permission from Latin America or South America. We just did it. And so that's one of the excuses or rationalizations we've used to interfere in Guatemala and other places like Panama to dig a canal, and Cuba, and all these different interventions. Well, here's another one: Dominican Republic. Extraordinary rendition is when you don't kill the person yourself, but you hand the person over to someone who wants to kill them, knowing full well what's going to happen to that person. And this is the story of the CIA conducting an operation, a couple operations of extraordinary rendition in the Dominican Republic. Jesus de Galindez was handed over for the exact same reason. Now, he was not the leader of the Dominican Republic at the time. He was actually a professor at Columbia University in New York City. And he was sort of in hiding. And by that, I mean, he felt like if he stayed in the Dominican Republic, because he was a vocal critic of the Trujillo government, which was our puppet, that he would be killed. He would be at risk. So he came to the United States to hide out during the time that Trujillo was in power, thinking that he'd be safe here. We captured him. We took him to Trujillo, to the Dominican Republic, who boiled him alive. They put him in a bathtub full of boiling water, and they boiled him alive. The Trujillo government. And that was only possible because our CIA captured him in broad daylight in New York City, put him on a plane, and sent him to Dominican Republic, handed him off to the Trujillo government, knowing full well what was going to happen to him. So this was a case where Trujillo, tired of listening to Galindez criticize his government from afar, said, if you want to do me a favor, you can bring me my enemy, and I'll owe you one. And that's exactly what we did. Cordell Hull, our former U.S. Secretary of State, once said of Trujillo, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And this was considered to be a successful operation. However, as you might imagine, there's a loose end in this whole thing. And the loose end is the pilot who flew him over there. His name was Gerald Murphy. And eventually, we, uh, the story was that he had flown Galindez back to the Dominican Republic, and he had been drugged. Galindez had been drugged, and of course Murphy knew all that. Murphy knew who his passenger was, what state he was in, who had brought him to the plane, the CIA, and where he dropped him off, to whom he dropped him off. He knew all the details. So they captured Gerald Murphy and handed him off to Trujillo as well. And Trujillo dumped him off a cliff into the swimming pool, which is offshore. It's called a swimming pool because that is a notorious part of the ocean there offshore of the Dominican Republic, which is heavily populated by sharks. And in other words, they fed him to the sharks. So this loose end was silenced by killing him after they had boiled alive the critic. And in both cases, the United States government, CIA, carrying out a program they call extraordinary rendition. We learned about extraordinary rendition in the church hearings in 75 when we had all their internal documents, and they defined what extraordinary rendition was, and they gave case examples, of which Gerald Murphy and Galindez were included. Here is another operation started in 1957, and it continues to this day. It is the only operation that we know of that never had an expiration date. All the operations we learned about in the mid-70s and have continued to learn about subsequent had beginning dates and end dates. This one continues to this present day. As far as I know, there still is no expiration date. There's no end date. It continues to this day. It's called Operation Mockingbird. This is another example of the CIA operating domestically. I've made a big point of that because I think it's very important to understand that some people get hung up in the idea that the CIA is only supposed to operate on foreign soil, and that is the charter. That's the law. But from its very inception, it has been operating domestically against the law. And that we saw that with MK Ultra, with all the hospitals and prisons and all the different folks that were used in the MK Ultra project here at home. And here's another case, Operation Mockingbird. And I want to establish early on in this discussion this precedent so that when we get to the assassinations, we don't get hung up on the idea that this is a domestic operation, so it couldn't be the CIA. When we understand that the CIA has been violating this law from the very inception, from its very beginning, then we no longer have that hang up. We can include the CIA as one of the suspects in the assassination of JFK, for example. Anyway, this is called Operation Mockingbird, and it is the successful CIA operation targeting U.S. media, Hollywood, and textbook companies, all in the business of disseminating information, whether by movie, by textbook, or by newspaper or television, whatever kind of U.S. media you want to you're talking about. It was to prevent news organizations from reporting on these covert ops. One of the things the CIA was concerned about was that word of these covert ops might leak, and at some point it might make its way into the news, especially overseas. One of the things that happens in the news business is that something might be reported in Iran or Guatemala or a European newspaper, and AP, the Associated Press, picks it up, and next thing you know, it's reported in American newspapers. And that's the last thing the CIA wants, is the American citizens learning about these covert ops that the CIA has been engaged in. So that's one of the agenda items here, is to prevent this from happening and to, quote, influence the American media, Hollywood, and textbook companies to control what information the American people get. That might be through withholding information. It also might be through disinformation or misinformation. However, whatever means are necessary to uh, basically to deceive the American people or to prevent the American people from even hearing the story to begin with. And you see here the agency paid and intimidated journalists into helping promote its message. Give you an example, famous Watergate reporter Carl Bernstein broke the story in '77 for Rolling Stone. This is when we first learned about Operation Mockingbird, right on the conclusion of the church hearings in the mid-'70s. And Bernstein revealed the workings of Operation Mockingbird, in which many journalists, including Pulitzer Prize winners who are getting all their scoops from the CIA, joined the CIA's payroll, in some cases writing fake stories or cooperating with the CIA and printing misinformation or disinformation or not covering certain stories. There's a lot of ways to control what information the American people get. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this program has never been terminated. It continues to this day. According to the documents, the overseer of this Mockingbird operation was, of course, Alan Dulles at the top. He's the one that created the program. He appointed Frank Wisner, just like he appointed Sidney Gottlieb to be over MK Ultra, another American program. Here he is appointing Frank Wisner to be the originator or the head of this Operation Mockingbird hierarchy. He was at that time the originator, or he was the head of Office of Special Projects in the CIA. He was known as the father of American covert operations. Alan Dulles is pictured at the top. Frank Wisner is in the middle. And then Cord Meyer at the bottom, he was the principal operative. In other words, he was Wisner's hatchet man. He was the creative genius behind all the Mockingbird operations. And as such, Cord Meyer was given the authority to appoint others under him who would help carry out the day-to-day. One of those was Richard Bissell. Richard Bissell came to fame later in the '60s, being intricately involved in the U-2 spy plane program and the Bay of Pigs operation, which was, of course, a big failure. So here are some of the players. You always start with Alan Dulles. You know, in interesting, all of these covert operations. It's one of the reasons why I spent so much time talking about Alan Dulles during World War II and his roots to Sullivan and Cromwell. This is a deep state figure. You don't get any more deep state than Alan and his brother John Foster Dulles. The Dulles brothers are as deep state as they come. You put them in charge of the CIA and the State Department, all of their agency under them is going to carry out these deep state agendas because the boss man is deep state. And so he picks Frank Wisner picks Cord Meyer picks Richard Bissell, and off they go. As we know, it had no termination date. And so I was just curious, and I did a little quick research into a lot of the figures, the deep state figures back when this program started, and compared them to a lot of the deep state figures that are contributing to the media to this day. And boy, is it not interesting to know that some of the biggest contributors who are in the business of propagandizing the American people still to this day are former intelligence officers. James Comey, until recently, had a TV gig after his time as FBI director. John Brennan still has a TV gig. I think it's CNN, maybe it's MSNBC. I think it's MSNBC. He's former director of the CIA. And James Clapper, the former director of the National Intelligence, was a paid contributor to CNN. So you bring in these former intelligence figures to report on the news, so to speak, as experts. And really what they're doing is they are operating as spokespeople, mouthpieces for these intelligence operations, giving the American people straight propaganda. They're still doing it. Anytime I see somebody, former CIA, former FBI, former director of national intelligence, whatever, I know that the news I'm getting is spun. It is it is propaganda. It's designed to support whatever the narrative must be. And of course, they're given this title of expert and this big high paying job with these networks. And the American people lap it up. Um, in this case, respected members of more than 25 major newspapers, wire agencies, and Hollywood studios when this program started came under the CIA control in the early 60s. And I give you a couple of examples. Henry Luce, who owned Life magazine. Life magazine was a big publication in those days. It was one of the premier publications. And of course, think about some of the scoops that Life magazine got in its heydays when Henry Luce owned it. And this is the this is how they feather each other's nest. Henry Luce agrees to do it in exchange for scoops. And so that's how Henry Luce's Life magazine got the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, the famous backyard photo, which it put on the cover, the Zapruder film. Uh, it was one of the first media outlets to get the reporting on the JFK assassination and all the major players because it was getting scoops straight from the CIA. Of course, it's presenting the CIA's perspective. That's why one of the frames in the Zapruder film issue was reversed so as to show the shot coming from the back and not from the front. They just reversed the frame. And they were able to do that because the CIA was in control of the Zapruder film at that time. And eventually Life magazine had it, and it was in their vaults for however many years until it was revealed later at the end of the decade. But they're working together. Life magazine and the CIA are working together. Or how about Newsweek and the Washington Post? Ben Bradley was their contact. Of course, he was the editor, and he was intricately involved in the Watergate stories that came out in the Washington Post. And the whole, that was a CIA operation. And Ben Bradley and his reporter, not Bernstein, but Woodward, Bob Woodward, who was former ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, spun the story to pin all the blame on Nixon and his plumbers. And of course, we found out years later that they were on the payroll of the CIA, reporting the story, the narrative, as the CIA wanted it reported, hiding the fact that all these people had ties back to intelligence. How about Howard Hughes produced all these movies, owned RKO Pictures. He worked hand in glove with the National Security Council. He was obviously one of the guys on this payroll to produce movies that presented propaganda to the American people subtly, but propaganda nonetheless. And I can go on and on and on. In fact, I've got a list here. These are, according to CIA documents and church hearings in 1975, these are people who wrote articles for Wisner. Remember, Wisner is in charge of this program. And they were provided with classified information by the CIA in exchange for their cooperation so that they could flesh out these stories. So they got access to material nobody else did. Joseph Alsop, who had a syndicated column in over 300 newspapers across the country. So he writes one column, it goes out 300 different newspapers. Imagine how many people read that. Stuart Alsop, obviously related, wrote for the New York Herald Tribune. So both the Alsop brothers wrote columns, and they were on the payroll of the CIA under Operation Mockingbird. James Reston wrote for the New York Times. C.D. Jackson for Time. Walter Pincus for the Washington Post. Walter Winchell for the New York Daily Mirror. Drew Pearson, Walter Lippmann, William Allen White, Edgar Ansel Maurer, all for the Chicago Daily News. Hal Hendricks for the Miami News. Whitelaw Reid for the New York Herald Tribune. Jerry O'Leary for the Washington Star. William Baggs for the Miami News. Herb Gold, Miami News. Charles Bartlett, Chattanooga Times. Now, if you go through and you just look at the geographical layout of all these different bought and paid for assets of the CIA. You can see that they are covering the country from sea to shining sea, from north to south, from east to west. That's the point. They have national publications, they have regional publications, they have syndicated columns that go out across the country, and they are covering the country with this propaganda. And of course, this is super secret. Nobody knows. Nobody knows all these reporters are working for the CIA, giving us, the American public, this straight propaganda. Nobody knows. Uh, also included in these church hearings and the documents, the CIA not only controlled these individuals that I just listed, and that's not a full list, by the way, that's a partial list, but they also controlled the following newspapers and wire agencies: CBS, which was owned by William Paley; Time Life, we've already indicated, was owned by Henry Luce; New York Times was owned by Arthur Hayes Sulzberger; New York Herald Tribune, owned by Helen Rogers Reed; New York Post, owned by Dorothy Schiff; Washington Post, owned by Al Friendly; Louisville Courier Journal, owned by Barry Bingham; Copley News Service, owned by James Copley; RKO, Howard Hughes. These are the biggest newspapers and media outlets, including Hollywood, that exist in the country. The CIA is not anybody's fool. They know to succeed in this program, they're going to have to co-opt or buy off or make assets out of the individuals whom everybody reads or listens to, and also the news outlets whom everybody listens to and reads. The church hearings concluded in their report, according to Congress in its 1976 published report, quote, the CIA currently, this was in 76, they're saying currently, and of course we've known now that there's no termination date, so you could say in 2025, the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and TV stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. You say, well, why should we be so concerned about their control of foreign individuals and foreign media outlets? What's that got to do with us? The way it works, remember now, the law says that the CIA is supposed to only operate on foreign soil. So what the CIA does is, according to Frank Church, it was CIA policy to use clandestine handling of journalists and authors to get information published initially in the foreign media and eventually get it disseminated in the United States. So the story is leaked to these foreign outlets, and then the U.S. media picks it up. Church quotes from one document written by the chief of the Covert Action Staff on how this process worked. Quote, get books published or distributed abroad without revealing any U.S. influence. In other words, let's secretly leak it to get these books and news articles published overseas by covertly subsidizing foreign publicans or booksellers. Later, he writes, quote, get books published for operational reasons, regardless of commercial viability. So these books don't have to be bestsellers. None of that matters. It's all about getting the U.S. press to pick up the story. And technically, we're in compliance. It is a foreign operation where we leak this information to foreign news sources. They publish it, and then the U.S. media, our assets here at home, dutifully pick up the story and print it here at home. And no one can say that they're getting the information or based on a domestic operation here, even though it's what it is. Church continues, he says, quote, over 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 67, right around the time JFK was killed. All these books eventually found their way into the American marketplace, either in their original form or repackaged as articles for American newspapers and magazines. That's why you buy off the American writers and the American news outlets, so that when you leak the story to your foreign assets, your foreign media outlets that you control. The ones here at home will go pick up those stories and print them here at home. And it's a way to launder the information. The CIA is technically not supposed to, by law, operate domestically. This is a way for them to have plausible deniability, whereby they say, well, if they got the information it was overseas from us, and any information here at home was not from us, it was from those foreign sources. It's just a game. You leak it to your foreign assets, and then your American assets, your domestic assets go and reprint it here at home. And that's how the game is played. By the way, this was recycled in 2016 in the big Russiagate thing against Trump. They did the same thing. They leaked all kinds of information to foreign media outlets and to foreign intelligence services, and then the American intelligence and American media picked up the stories. They did the same thing. History repeats. It's a pattern. That's how you know who's behind it. It's their standard operating procedure. In 1961, in church hearings, the chief of the agency's propaganda wrote, quote, "The advantage of our direct contract with the author is that we can acquaint him in great detail with our intentions, that we can provide him with whatever material we want him to include, and then we can check the manuscript at every stage," talking about the agency, "to make sure the actual manuscript will correspond with our operational and propagandistic intentions." Do I really need to explain that? It's about controlling the information that the American people receive. And you do it any number of ways. You leak the information to your American assets directly, or you leak it to the foreign assets directly, and the American ones pick it up. You have your own publishing houses that you control so that they'll publish the books. They don't have to sell. That's not the point. It's about getting it out in circulation so that somebody else will pick up the story and write about it or talk about it or make a movie about it, whatever. It's a way to launder information, all propaganda, as they say so here, our operational and propagandistic intention. It's a way for the CIA to control what information American people get. And they do so through propaganda. And they literally pay off these media members and these media outlets, and they leak information to foreign outlets that the American media outlets and personalities can reprint, can repackage in their own stories. Or they put their own people who have since retired from these intelligence posts in these high-ranking media positions, like I said, James Comey, James Clapper, and John Brennan. And they just straight scoop give the story to the American people. And it's all it is propaganda. They have so many means by which they can propagandize the American people. And Church goes on, he quotes Thomas Karamessines, who was in the CIA. He says, quote, "If you plant an article in some paper overseas, and it is a hard-hitting article or a revelation, there is no way of guaranteeing that it is not going to be picked up and published by the Associated Press in this country." In other words, what he's saying is, that's the point. Let's get these things printed, or that is to our advantage, and it'll be reprinted. Or if it is something that might be controversial to us and reveals something about us that we don't want, there's no guarantee that it won't be picked up. So we need to stop that before it happens. So as a means of controlling that information, the CIA would both plant stories that they wanted printed and prevent stories that they didn't want printed, according to Thomas Karamessines. And remember now, the important thing is, this is a domestic operation. The audience of this is not the foreign population. We don't care what the foreign population thinks. It's all about controlling what the American people think, what they're reading, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're thinking. It is a sort of an extension of MK Ultra in the sense that they are attempting to control the minds of the American people. It's a mind control operation. From CIA documents, Church was able to identify over 50 U.S. journalists who were employed directly by the agency. 50. He said there's actually more and enjoyed a very close relationship with the CIA and were being paid regularly for their services. Some of those received occasional gifts and reimbursements. And so there was 50 that he had record were directly employed, and then there were more that got occasional gifts and reimbursements from the CIA. So it's 50 plus. He said that this number was probably only the tip of the iceberg because the CIA refused to, quote, provide the names of its media agents or the names of media organizations with which they are connected. Church was also aware that, according to the Otis Pike report in the House, most of these payments were not documented. So what we have learned and what we've been discussing today in this episode, as terrible as it is, as consequential as it is, and continues to be to this day, we only know a little bit of the truth and how extensive this is. There's a picture of Cord Meyer, who was the principal operative of this whole operation. CIA officer E. Howard Hunt, according to Freak Church, arranged for books to be reviewed by certain writers in the national press, encouraging hostile reviews by a, quote, CIA writer under contract for targeted authors. In other words, we even had the CIA even had an operation included in Mockingbird that would give poor reviews to authors who wrote exposés of the CIA and its covert operations, and then positive reviews of its preferred assets and the stories or books that they wrote. So it even went and extended to as far as book and movie reviews. They didn't leave any stone unturned. Church concluded, quote, in examining the CIA's past and present use of the U.S. media, the committee finds two reasons for concern. First, is the potential inherent in covert media operations for manipulating or incidentally misleading the American public. Completely, it was intentional. The second is the damage to the credibility and independence of a free press, which may be caused by covert relationship with the U.S. journalists and media organization. And that is where we are today. Church was prophetic. We now know that we have been propagandized for years. I've seen a waking up. It's happened within my own heart and mind. You wouldn't believe how I've changed. When I started teaching in 1997, I believed all I was taught, and I regurgitated it word for word. It has been since 1997 that there's been a waking up process that has taken place in my heart and mind. So much so that I now realize, almost 30 years too late, that what I knew in 1997, most of it was straight propaganda. Most of it was completely untrue. And I believed it. I was a fully functioning, intelligent human being, or so I thought, educating youth in lies and propaganda. That's what I was doing. And it's taken 30 years, and I'm nowhere near where I need to be. I'm just sharing my waking up process in real time as it happens. And I think there's millions of us out there who are in the same boat. We are awake to the fact, because of events like the church hearings, we are awake to what the CIA's been up to, what our government's been up to, how we have been propagandized, lied to, deceived, betrayed, and how treason has been carried out in our name, time and time again. We are awake to it now. And where it leaves us now is we don't believe anything the media tells us. It has damaged the credibility and the independence of a free press to the extent that most of us are so cynical and we don't trust what we're told. And it extends past just the media, the free press. It also extends to our government, because we now know that the government and the media has been working together, lying to us. So I've never seen the credibility of institutions in America at such low. I've never seen the credibility so low. We don't believe what our government institutions tell us, and we certainly don't believe what the media tells us about those government institutions or the pro or just the news events of the world. We always, I have begun to filter it through a very skeptical filter now, and I believe I'm almost reflexively being lied to about everything. And that's the damage that this has caused. It has undercut the faith in our institution and the trust in our media. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And it only grows exponentially because in my lifetime, I've seen, in all of our lifetimes, we've seen how social media has amplified what the media's reach. We now have learned in the last few years how many of the people currently in charge of moderating content at different social media companies like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, a lot of them, if you look in their hierarchies, who's leading those organizations, especially the ones in the content phase, the content part, a lot of these are former intelligence officials, former government, high-ranking government officials who, after they retire or cycle out of the government, go right into careers from the CIA, the FBI, and the U.S. Department of Defense, right into Facebook, Google, and Twitter, which we now call X. And one of the famous ones during the Russiagate covert op against Trump was James Baker, a former FBI lawyer and Russiagate conspirator who was involved in the operation against Donald Trump, went over and got a job with X and became part of the moderating content board, or whatever you want to call it, that silenced conservatives or silenced Trump or silenced people who are skeptical of COVID or whatever the issue might have been. And he's straight out of the FBI, and he had already shown who he was in his efforts to frame Donald Trump in the Russiagate scam or hoax, whatever you want to call it. That's just one example. There's countless examples. Here's a few news. These are just relatively recent. Here at top left, Twitter files. FBI paid $3.5 million to Twitter to bury basically the Hunter Biden laptop story, call it Russian disinformation. Very, very famous propaganda. The government, the FBI, our government paid Twitter $3.5 million to propagandize the American people. Here's another article, top middle. Meet the ex-CIA agents deciding Facebook's content policy. Top right, Daily Mail. Twittergate deepens. FBI refuses to reveal how many social media firms it is secretly influencing amid accusations it broke the law by pushing Twitter to remove accounts and hand over user location details, new trove reveals. Bottom middle, Twitter files illustrate how intelligence agencies can rig politics, or the public information, right? Bottom right, our FBI and CIA agents sheep dipped at Twitter and other tech companies. Sheep dipping is an intelligence term, which means you dip somebody in a solution like they did in Europe with the sheep to basically give them a false or a different alternative identity kind of a thing. And so here's just a few examples. Here is a famous picture here of all the Twitter, Facebook, Google employees that came out of the intelligence agencies. You see Facebook, there's 3, 6, 9, there's 12 of them. CIA, FBI, NSC, you see the State Department, and Twitter's got same batch of people. Google's got the same batch of people. Daily Mail, top right, spooks infiltrate Silicon Valley. Facebook is riddled with ex-CIA agents, including President's briefer, who now runs, quote, harmful content team. So many ex-FBI work at Twitter They have a Slack channel, and Google is rife with ex-CIA. I think you guys kind of understand my point. Operation Mockingbird, the only operation to date that we know of, that has a beginning date, 1957, but no end date. It continues to this day. And it is a domestic operation by our intelligence uh, community, primarily the CIA, to propagandize the American people. They have all kinds of methods. They can control individual assets. They can control media outlets. They can plant stories. They can bury stories. They can use disinformation or misinformation to say this is Russian disinformation. They can put their own people on networks. They can book review, movie review. They can have you banned from social media, get your account removed. This is why Chuck Schumer said when he was talking about Trump, I think this was back in 16, he said, I don't know why he's picking up the fight with the intelligence agencies. They have 8 million ways to next Sunday to get back at you. This is just in the area of information. This is just in the area of propaganda, the ways they have of propagandizing the American people. This is why it's so dangerous to believe at face value anything you're told on TV or read in a newspaper, and what you don't know the source of that author's income, or the person on the news broadcast who's talking, the expert. You don't know who's paying for his house payment. We don't know these things. It's all hidden. It's all secret. And believe me, that's who they're going to be loyal to, and that's how they're going to slant the story. And that's the propaganda that's how effective these propaganda campaigns are. And when you think, well, this story was just a reprint from a story in an Italian newspaper, so surely it's true. It's not CIA plant. Turns out it is. Turns out that's another way to launder information. So that's the battleground going forward, is the battle of information. What information can be believed and what information is straight propaganda? That is the quandary we find ourselves in. We can't trust at face value. We just can't trust everybody like we used to. Previous generations trusted Tom Brokaw. Previous generations trusted Walter Cronkite. Previous generations trusted certain news programs, 60 Minutes or whatever, until we realized that all this time we've been propagandized. I mean, from 57 on, that's a long time, folks. Think of all the big events that have happened in our world from 57 on. And you realize that all of these media outlets were controlled by the CIA. And when you really get in and start researching, let's just say one of these events, the JFK assassination in 63, and you find out that it was the CIA that was a primary suspect in that assassination, and they're the ones controlling the news. They're the ones controlling the information. Turns out they're also controlling the investigation, the Warren Commission through Alan Dulles. They are the ones controlling all of this information, textbooks, the movies, the news programs, the news articles. Is it any wonder poor hapless Lee Harvey Oswald got blamed and the American people lapped it up for all these years? Because we didn't know at the time that we were being lied to. Now we know. You can make an argument that folks back in the 50s and 60s have an excuse. They didn't know. But we do. It's different now. We do know. So if you still believe the lie, that says something more about you than it does about the government, the CIA, the media, etc. Okay, that's enough for today. Thanks for joining in. Please hit the like button, share, comment, subscribe, all the things. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.